So good evening to everybody. My name is Juhi, and I welcome you all on behalf of the team at Vikalp Sangam, Rima and Devanshi here. We've got a very interesting group of people doing some very good work, especially I think now being more relevant as we've all gone through our second wave of the pandemic. I would just want to take about 2 minutes to let people know, whoever is new on this group, participating in this Varta for the first time, that the Vikalp Vartas are a series of dialogues that we at Vikalp Sangam have initiated in May 2020, when the pandemic got us all locked at home for the first time. And we wanted the dialogues, which Vikalp Sangam, which is a confluence of dialogues on alternatives, could not happen physically, to continue, as well as for us to continue to bring the voices from the grassroots out to the larger groups and communities around India and the globe. Because this entire series was initiated after we realized that the voices from the ground were not being heard through this pandemic. And somehow this pandemic really created a bigger divide between the ground-based voices and the people who were on so-called the privileged end of life. We took a break also from these Vartas for a little while, because all of us had a lot of changes within the organizations we were working in, the spaces that we were working in, the ecosystems that we were working in, that we also needed to somewhere regroup within ourselves to come back and see how we can restart these dialogues. And this is the second or the second of the series now for this year, where we're now trying to look at how there are alternatives available to us, which would help us through any of these pandemics or disasters in the future. Today, we've got a really interesting group, and I'm glad that I could chat with them a little earlier before we came onto this call. And the topic for the day is Decentralizing Digital Futures. It's a group of people from across the world who've come together, specifically what I've understood, mostly design researchers who've worked with technology in varied forms, but now want to see in their own spaces how technology can be brought in to our rural communities. And this is a project that started in 2018, so they were way ahead of COVID times to think that we would need these kind of solutions, and had started working on it in Karnataka. Babita George, who's going to be a moderator for this evening, will introduce each of our speakers and this project more deeply. And I'm not going to take too much of the time of the Varta and hand over the space to Babita. Babita, thank you so much for bringing this lovely group together. And I hope we do have more participants who join us, but I think we can start and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Juhi, and thank you so much for inviting us. My name is Babita. I'm calling from Bangalore. I'm part of a design research studio called Quicksand. We're based in multiple cities in India, and we work primarily in design research, looking at how products, services, new technologies ought to be developed with people, with communities, and in a manner that really fits their context and their lives. So today, the group that we have here, we've been working together for the past 2-3 years on a project called Decentralising Digital. In the course of the evening today, I will set up the project. I will give you a little bit of a context to the project, but then we'll have each of our partners tell you a little bit about their own work, as well as how that came into what we were exploring in the project. I'm going to start sharing my screen, if that's okay. Yeah. I'm hoping that's fine. So this project was really a collaboration between all the people who are on this call, as well as a few of our other partners who are not here today. But essentially, for the past few years, a lot of our combined work and efforts had been around exploring the sort of challenges and opportunities that emerging digital technologies were really providing to different contexts. And we really wanted to explore the contours of a different future, a future where digital technologies were inspired and informed by local contexts and considerations. And to our mind, at least, this sort of narrative about a hopeful future, it was a sharp contrast to the way digital technologies are largely being imagined right now, where and how they're designed and manufactured now. And so through the project, we were also kind of thinking about the questions around the purpose of innovation and the ways in which we measure and create value. So today we're going to hear from a lot of our other partners about how they're exploring this in their own work. So as you would have seen in most of the sectors, ranging from agriculture to forest conservation, water management, education, there's been like a huge, I don't know why my screen's not moving.
Just stop screen share once and do it again, Babita.
Yeah, I'm just going to stay with like non-full screen. So really, I think across all of these spaces, we're seeing that technology is increasingly being the norm, but often at the cost of not allowing those who it most impacts to participate in that. So often people who are unfamiliar with these technologies, at least the way it's being pushed, cannot participate in imagining or making a future for themselves within that narrative. So like, I think Vishala will talk a lot more about this, but one of the contexts that we considered was how certification of organic farming occurs right now, and the role that technology plays in the hugely problematic way in which it excludes the actual farmers who are doing the work on the ground. So our effort really was to kind of enable and support these marginalized communities who often don't have the voice to participate in this discussion because the discussion itself is unfamiliar to them. So we were trying to kind of think about how do we challenge these existing narratives with new stories, with new narratives that can actually reflect the hopes that people have for themselves and for the role that technologies can play in enabling them to participate in these futures. And in design, there is a sort of a practice called speculative design that some of you might be familiar with. And we wanted to challenge that as well. Some of us here are designers, and we wanted to challenge that from the point of view of questioning how it allowed people to participate within it and kind of thinking about the power dynamic that the designer herself brings into the equation. So instead of calling it preferable futures, which is often what's talked about, we wanted to think about hopeful futures, because no matter where we are, we found that hope is something that we're all co-invested in, that we all share, and therefore we wanted these futures to reflect that same hope. So, and the final thing kind of that before we move on to kind of hearing from our other partners was the kind of power of stories. Oftentimes we see that the manner in which conversations happen, the manner in which these narratives emerge, tends to take formats that again excludes people. And stories we found were a really powerful way to bring different types of people together that allowed people to say things in their own voice and not have others speak their own stories. So we felt that they were really powerful bridges that could connect and engage different types of stakeholders. So that's really what we tried to explore within the project. And there were 4 broad questions that over the course of the 2 years we discovered that we would like these questions to really frame our stories. So what would farmers and consumers of the future look like? How might data be utilized to foster agency in rural communities in the future? And how can the very real way of experimentation and the very real way of life that all of them live with, how can we bring that into the space of technology to enable them to participate in and shape their futures? And how can all of this kind of add up towards fostering trust between farmers and communities? And I think where I will leave this is to kind of talk about our community partners. You'll get to see them today. I think all of them really are organizations that have been working for decades with communities to think about pathways for empowerment and representation. They were already working with the kind of complex issues that we wanted to engage with as well. So today I'm going to invite them to also share a little bit about their work and how the approach that we took within the project might have mirrored what they were already doing or might have added to their practice. And then at some point, we'll also talk about specific design approaches that we took within the project. These are again pictures from when we were out doing research and using some of these design probes in the field to kind of build these future narratives. What we have is a website where we have documented all of this. We have the stories up there, and we'd love for all of you to really look at them and engage with them more, because for us, this project hasn't come to an end. It's really the beginning of a conversation, and we'd like to keep that alive. We'd like to experiment more. We'd like to explore this further with all of you, and we're hoping that what we've started can prove to be a provocation, a cue for all of you to think about this more. So with that, I am going to invite our partners to begin to share. Can I also request all of you to give like brief introductions to yourself and the work that you do, because again, I don't want to talk for you. So Vishala, if I can start with you.
Yes, Babita. Thank you. Thanks, Babita. Thanks to Vikalp Sangam. I am Vishala. I'm from Bangalore, and we have a collective called the Buffalo Back Collective, which does farmers markets in Bangalore for organic farmers. And other than that, I manage an organization called PGS Organic Council, where we work on a community-owned, community-based alternate certification for organic farmers. So that's about the work that we are largely engaged with. But I really thank Vikalp Sangam for doing this today, because it's, honestly speaking, the last 2 years, I think, in terms of these tech innovations and developments has been maddening. And being in Bangalore, I think you are never far away from a startup. I think I sometimes feel that every other person I meet seems to have a startup. And today the big thing is all about either agri-tech or fintech. So agri-tech and the kind of solutions that for some reason, I think we also get entangled in these discussions, and we are somewhere part of trying to understand on what's happening, or invited to certain forums also where such solutions are discussed. And honestly speaking, every time I have come back wondering what the problem is. When the solutions have been like beautifully presented, and then the technology seems so promising, and then there's been no clue about what the problem is. So I guess in an ecosystem like this, coming back and recalling all that we did for 2 years and try to understand technology, and in fact kind of demystify this idea of technology, make it simple, make it something which was In fact, the whole process was very intuitive, very tactile for us. And the probes were actually physical equipments. They were not intimidating objects or intimidating tech words and jargons which were used while we were interacting with the communities. In fact, I remember, I think somewhere around last year, I called Dinesh and I said, I feel like a lab rat myself, because I think one of the biggest tech solution talk now again seems to be this fixing this food supply chain. Yeah. So somehow there seem to be a lot of problems, and then there seems to be fixes available. And we've been wondering, we've been working on farmers markets for 10 years. Yes, we do have problems, but then the solutions come from the people, because these markets that we have been working on, these transactions that we have been nurturing, has always been with the farmers and the consumers centered. But somehow the whole supply chain idea seems to be consumer versus farmers. And the assumption always is that there is always a trust issue between the farmers and the consumers, which is such a wrong premise to be actually devising a solution upon or building something upon. And then the fixes are always tech-based. And today's news, in fact, the headlines is that this regulatory body called APEDA, which administers and governs a certification system called the third-party certification system for organic, suspended 4 certifying bodies. And the reason is a specific disallowed chemical residue found in sesame exports to Europe. So while, yeah, there are many issues around that, but the thing is, the question that we all raised was, APEDA's claim to this third-party certification was that it uses the robust technology and captures data at all possible critical points. So it's been a system which has been around for 10 or 15 years. So there is data capture at all points, and all vital data is captured. And still there was this problem. And then the first news that we get is that these certifying bodies are going to be removed from the work. And then there are, of course, cascading issues. There's going to be, we don't know how the farmers are going to be affected by a certifying body just being removed from the whole system. So and then the farmers, how is it going to affect these farmers? And where did this chemical come in? So there are so many questions which this whole tech solution, a robust system that exists, is not able to answer, because today's news is, I think it's after 15 days of this issue propped up, and we still don't have answers to that. Yeah. And so we still have many questions about these solutions that are offered, and especially the whole way in which these problems are tackled. Coming to what we did, I think this large world of tech is too overwhelming for us to spend too much time on it also. So coming to this experience, I think that the 2 years, the 1.5 years that we spent in dialogues, in talking and discussing and understanding was very, very interesting. The farmers also, the people that we were working with, there were a few who came for workshops in Bangalore, and then we visited some of them. We spent a lot of time on the field. They still recall those experiences, and they still think about it and say, oh, that was so interesting. What happened to that? So we've also been like keeping those conversations. In fact, some of those that we figured out on those labels and those details, we have executed them now on some of the farmers, write their own stories on their products and send. In fact, we recently started something. We said, if the kids can write something in the farm, in Kannada, in their local language, and just take a photograph and send it on the WhatsApp group, because we have a group of customers anyway. We said, they could just take a photograph and send it directly. Maybe something like a recipe or something about the farm, just about the village that they want to say something. They could just write and send it on the WhatsApp group. And this is something that we've been trying to encourage as much as, it's like the whole system and the way it's been working on not appreciating this. And that's been my grouse actually right through, where people are not encouraged to talk and say their stories, and I mean to such an extent that the farmers find it actually very difficult to even comprehend, beyond the fact that they're constantly burdened by these regular issues of the market, the price, and just these two. I think it takes so much of their mind space that they are not given the space and the time to actually talk about other things that are so relevant, so important part of their daily life. Yeah. And that still exists. And I guess with more and more of the solution-based approach and more of these regulatory frameworks getting tighter and tighter with things, I guess the whole intuitiveness and the joy of growing, the joy of being there is being like slowly removed from the whole process. And honestly speaking, I don't know, sometimes I wonder if there are this n number of good things happen post corona, the changes in mindsets and consumers or something, there are also this n number of things that's happening in terms of looking at the whole thing as a problem, again a bigger problem, because the narrative is that we are not resilient enough to face a problem like a pandemic, and so then we need this newer solutions, and that's actually, I think, a bigger burden on the farmers. As much as there's news that the market is picking up, there's more appreciation for organic food, which is healthier. So there's been this whole positives and the negatives post corona, and like I said, for everything, Bangalore and Hyderabad seems to be producing tech-based solutions for some reason for the entire country. Yes, so I think, and more about this, the decentralized digital, I think what was also very interesting is that after a point, of course, the farmers warmed up to the idea that yes, they could actually start imagining, they could actually start to start thinking out of the box. It did take a lot of time, but then like one instance that we've also mentioned is when we were thinking of a specific physical object that we made as a tool that will enable interactions between farmer and the consumers, the farmers actually looked at it as something more useful on their farm. They said maybe this could alert us when an animal comes in or when there's a pest. Yeah. But what was also very, very interesting is that when the farmers were asked on what are the solutions or where is it that they need some interventions, I think very rarely we come across farmers who want all their tasks eased out or removed off or checked off that to-do list. It's always asking for this very small intervention on maybe just this warning. Like, for example, when it's about pest management, they just want to be probably just warned about something happening, but they're not really seeking solution to manage that pest. They don't want you to give a pesticide formula. They don't want you to give a prescription and say that, okay, now this is what you should be doing. Yeah. And that, I think, is very, very hopeful for people like us, where we hope that those traditional knowledge systems and those ways in which farmers know how to manage the crops, manage the soil, manage the pests will continue to live in spite of all these tech intervention. And that's where I think such approaches on decentralizing, talking, having conversations with them. And nowadays, I feel we need these more with consumers understanding on what exactly they want to know. Yeah. Rather than having this very large view about now, how do I trust farmers? So I think we are also trying to break that down and ask now, maybe you should start telling us that what you want to know to be able to trust the farmers and what you want to know about how your food is grown. So that the right stories and then the connections happen, the relationships happen. So that way, yes, I think it's interesting to explore such ways in which the same tech tools and the same tech language can be used in a more meaningful way. Yeah, thank you. I think I have used up my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Vishala. I mean, I guess we can go into some of later in the discussion, particularly around like the tendency for technology solutions to be exactly that. When you have a hammer, everything's a nail, and the need to problematize and solutionize for everything. But before that, we'll also hear from the others. So Arshiya, if you could go next, please.
Yes, thank you. My name's Arshiya. I actually started off as a human geographer, and my interest and career, which actually began at Kalpavriksha, was trying to do the most participatory research on how indigenous communities use landscapes, live and depend on forests, and what kind of changes might be occurring in some of these areas. And I've worked mostly in the Western Ghats part of Karnataka. What's interesting about the work that I do now at Black Baza Coffee is that coffee is, without a doubt, one of the most commodified crops on the planet, right? And coffee was always grown to be sold, particularly in parts of India. And where coffee is grown today, there would be food. So people would grow ragi, they'd grow millet, they'd grow rice in some places. And so coffee has replaced what would have been food. That makes it a kind of bittersweet space to really be working in. And what's interesting when we think about markets and nature and people's cultures is that as it's so commodified, it's also been the space for the most experimentation on sustainability. So if you walk down a supermarket aisle in North America or Europe, you'll be filled, it'll be filled with bags of coffee that have various certification labels on them. So you'd see birds, you'd see farmers' faces, you'd see trees, you'd see forests. The bags of coffee would be promising you a lot. That's in some sense the kind of space for where my academic research started. I wanted to understand whether there was a disconnect or not, and if there was a disconnect, what might that hopeful future be? So when we started working on this project, and still perhaps even in the work that we've continued on from this project, this trying to understand or find answers for what hopeful futures might be is still very much at the core of it. But when we started this project, and through the course of the Decentralising Digital project, there was some very interesting, I think, learnings for me as I participated, or I was a kind of co-passenger on this. The first is, of course, now with a lot of the coffee growers we work with are indigenous communities. So they were till very recently, not growing coffee. Coffee has a very young history actually in many parts of India, particularly where coffee coexists with very dense forests. What's happened of late is people are constantly talking about things that growers cannot see, cannot touch, cannot smell, cannot hear. And technology is one of them. And so this conversations or sets of conversations around what people cannot touch and feel has been intimidating, as Vishala said, and of course, extremely exclusive as well. From a conversation we were having with Babita just yesterday, a couple of some of the really kind of powerful things that some of our producers were saying was that, technology or the demand from consumers to prove that our coffee is grown in a certain way, whether it's under forest cover, whether it's organic or whatever, has come from a consumer. So the kind of demand for technology or technology-based solution or this thing to prove that it's grown in a particular way feels also very, very one way and extractive. So it's something I need to do to prove to my consumer or customer that I am following certain practices, but I don't necessarily have the platform or agency to ask them something in exchange. So that extractive process for some people feels very reconciliatory, like they've kind of reconciled that this is the way that the market in the future is, that I will constantly be asked to prove or provide evidence, to provide proof of how I'm continuing to farm. We're trying to see whether we can actually question that at its fundamental. Like, does the flow of technology have to be one way? Does the flow of trust therefore also have to be one way, as we kind of look at markets in the future? So I mean, that's kind of where I think I'd like to leave it at. But one of the questions that Babita put up on the slide was about what consumers of the future would look like. And this is a conversation we've had, during the project, after the project, with, coffee growers we work with, because we're still figuring it out. We do a lot to, I think, dance around our consumers as well, by trying to, we could argue that telling stories is important. Perhaps it's also dancing around. I don't know. But I'm actually, I think we need to ask for a more equal relationship. I think that connection between producer to consumer, however it's mediated, even if it's, an organization like Black Baza Coffee in the middle, has to just be more equal. And I don't know what a more equal future would look like. So for me, a hopeful future is certainly a more equal one. And I'm thinking a lot these days about what equal means really in the context of the work we work in, particularly because, as I said, the distance that coffee beans travel from a small hamlet in the Western Ghats all the way to maybe Scandinavia, where the per capita consumption's the largest, is millions and millions, well, many miles, right? What is the way that we try and hold everybody accountable in that? Is it technology? Is it not? The qualitative human geographer in me asks for stories, like many of you, and asks for stories in substitution of maybe some of the more measurable, quantified metrics that generally seem to be what technology is becoming. I'm, I think, excited about how we can really maybe be more demanding about that relationship and that connection, beyond it just being a one-way flow from producer to consumer to prove or provide evidence, or even maybe provide a story. I don't know what storytelling both ways looks like. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Arshiya. Hope, again, like lots of things we can unpack later. But I'm going to ask Dinesh, who's on the road, just like we've been on this project and continue to be. So Dinesh, over to you.
Yeah, firstly, apologies. We meant to reach some place before 4 and got delayed. And so we ended up on the road. Thank you for the two amazing use cases, Arshiya and Vishala. So I want to put what we are doing in context of what they were talking about. And yeah, especially with Vishala, we have spoken quite a lot on how we can go and what the role of technology can be. More in terms of that is an early stage of technology, and we need more technology to solve the issues that came up in Vishala's what she said. So when you look at what Arshiya was saying, how would we convince the consumers, right? Something is trustable. And we flip it around, then you'll see like what's going on in the rural areas. We've been pushing so much of information, whether it's schools, whether it's TVs, whether it's now these days through internet, social media, a lot of information is pushed to them. And they seem to trust it all, right? And that's the other end of the spectrum of this trust. So when more educated you are, more aware of the things, you start questioning, where is it coming from, what's going on and all that. And what we have kind of constructed for the rural communities is trust us. All information that comes to you is trustable. So now you go to that place and then you see like what does it mean for them to express themselves in a way that they, number one, trust each other, and the outside world trusts what they're saying. So if you look at that, we are opening up this box in at both ends, and then trying to figure out what it all means on the long run. And especially in our context, we call it a rural research lab because it's so hard to kind of say how to open this box. So there are multiple dimensions to it. One is to bring expression. um, do you want a community radio? Like, how do you kind of make them listen to each other, right? When do they get a chance to listen to their own daughters? And then there is the craft making part, right? How do they kind of sit together with the family and friends and make something? Because now they are either in the agricultural spaces, they run back home and do their household activities, or now they're going into garment factories and other things. There is, you believe it or not, there is no community space in the 5 villages that we work with. Like, there's not a single community space other than schools. And during the pandemic, the schools were closed, and uh, so so there was no way that even for isolation, for early symptom, when there is early COVID symptoms, just to isolate, there were no places where there was both toilets available and there was, the people could be isolated. Anyway, in this, for this, what we have done primarily is to put a mesh network together, and it's basically a bunch of Libre routers which mesh with each other when you keep adding. And we have probably connected about 3-4 square kilometers, covering a good 3-4 villages. And this is the main infrastructure over which we want to kind of start looking at what decentralization means. So one of the primary things that we want to kind of experiment with is, if you want to talk to each other, you want to make stories from the content that you already have, right? So now, whose content is it? How do you make stories? Just to give like a small example, probably on a tangent, you go to any of these villages now, all their mythological, tribal mythologies are being gone. Like, every year we visit them, it's less and less. But the mainstream, the Ramayana mythology, you name it, but the mainstream thing that they listen to from the TVs, the programs, that's becoming their thing. So that's very interesting, and it's very disillusioning. At a great speed, it's been um, almost gone. So in such a place, what does it mean to kind of collect their stories? What is their memories feel like? And how do you build on that to create who they are? And then who would trust their stories going forward, right? It's not as bad as it looks, because when we go to some rural uh, temple, the fort story. Yeah. So when we go to some rural temples and their jatres, the fairs around, the annual fairs or the once in 5-year fairs, we'll see a lot of their communities coming there and sharing the stories. And they would be flying in from different countries. They would be flying in from different parts of India. You won't even believe, like, all these tribals in different parts of the world come together because you are sharing stories. But that's not happening online. Because of this huge disparity and the bridge, that they have to build. And one of the things that we want to also look at is, what does it mean to have inclusive digital spaces. And I mean, from the West and from where we are today with respect to what we can afford, we've been insisting on personal devices, But what does it mean when you have a mixed group of people? Some of them can read and write, most of them who cannot. Some of them are old, some of them are very young. What is a un-PC that kind of helps hold the family or context together is something that we are also looking at. So what is the fourth story you tell, Shafali?
Hi guys. So we were all like traveling and we went to this place near Orcha, which was called Gadkundar. And there was this person there. He was the security guard there. So he took us around that fort, like, and in so he had these stories about the fort, which he was told by his grandfather's grandfather, and they had been like trickling down to him. And when we talked to him, like he always told that this is the like his sentence was ki ye hakikat hai, like this is the reality, and what you will find on Wikipedia or some mainstream thing that so anybody can write, but these oral traditions which the stories are going on, these are the things which are real, the truth. So like he told us about the artifacts that he had from those times at his house. Like he had a sword, he had bartan, like utensils and all. So these sort of narratives, where do these narratives go? And if we could be like inclusive of these narratives, then we would be making this sort of a hopeful future or that space for it.
Yeah, it was just a by chance that we bumped into him, and it was just a huge eye opener. I mean, we also have courts. We're trying to in the mesh network area. We're also trying to kind of bring this kind of youth or girls who would come up and take people around, uh, talk about their own history, stories, and all that. But this was just an eye opener. He was just out there, so comfortable, and going into deep stories. And whenever I asked a question, "What do you know anything about that?" Let me tell you about that. He would start. And one of the beautiful things he talked about was also the vulture, how the vultures are disappearing. And there is this Gidwahini temple, which is the vulture as a vehicle for Parvati. So many things he told us. It was quite amazing. So I'll stop here. But one of the things that I also want to kind of connect directly to the project with Quicksand was that it was a bit of an eye opener for me. Some of the little devices that Quicksand and the group brought to the craft center. And while initially it was like, what are they doing? What is it? How would they even communicate with it? Kind of feeling. But as they started playing with it, I had this sudden feeling that we've not been able to, other than in the schools where you take an algebraic expression or do a geometric something and call it an abstraction of something, we've not been able to give such and a way to abstract things out. And I felt like that was an important thing, that how do we, in building the stories or with technology, how do you kind of, instead of being always on the concrete, because when they narrate a story, it's a lot of abstractions in it, right? But when it comes to technology, I don't think we are kind of communicating in a way that these abstractions kind of are manipulable. They can handle those and play with it or talk about it to each other, and that. And this is also related to how we want to kind of communicate with Vishala's context on what is organic farming, what is the amount of growth in a particular field, right? So all these things are kind of connecting to each other. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dinesh, and your co-passenger who told the fourth story. We don't
Shafali.
know. Shefali. So I think these were very like these were absolutely the kind of context where we were engaging with. So just to kind of, we will get back into some of these discussions, and there are some really important strands to maybe unpack. But before that, I'm going to ask John to also maybe reflect on this sort of zoomed out picture of technology, often context that as designers we're thrown into. So John, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just set this screen up. Is that appearing okay?
Yes.
Great. So this is more maybe for reference, and hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm humbled to see so many people join. And I will give a bit of background maybe about why we started to do this project and where I come from. So my name is John Rogers. I am an academic. I work between creative technology and design, very much sharing everyone's decentralized grassroots philosophy, particularly coming from my engineering and technology background, as I maybe foreground it by working with wonderful designers such as Babita at Quicksand and all her team, and obviously with Pete, who's a long-term friend and collaborator. And I've been coming to India for for many, many years, professionally for the last maybe over a decade, teaching and researching around decentralized technologies. This first slide is from some of my friends who work at Mozilla, and it's really kind of saying how healthy is our relationship with the internet. And this maybe write down this Internet Health Report link, and we can share that later. But one of the main things of that still is we're talking about technology, and why do we want to decentralize? Well, half of the world still has no internet. And you know this, we know this, but what does that mean in a pandemic? The lived experience, I think, was mentioned before. The lived experience of not being able to do homeschooling because there's no online school that my children were privileged to do here. There is no online doctor if you need to speak to someone because you have a persistent cough and you're worried it's COVID. These are real lived experiences. They're not just numbers and statistics. So if half the world is not able to have the internet, and yet the internet appears to be the answer to everything, then half of the people have no answers and no ability to even pose the questions. And this is a serious thing for the world, and I think we need to urgently address this. Let me go next slide. Oh, I'm getting your thing now. This is how we do it. Change the thing. I was getting the beep. Sometimes this is known, I think, and more recently being more direct and human language. This is digital colonialism. And it's not, and it's threatening the global south, but I think it's threatening the whole world. It's actually threatening the people that came up with this. If we look at the fact that more or less the entire digital world is controlled by a handful, maybe 4 or 5 companies in the US, or separately if you live in China. And they're controlling the whole world, but actually it's destroying the US as much as it's destroying the rest of the world. And we've seen the challenges facing democracy and truth, I think, has come up a number of times, and trust is very much in question. And we see this, don't we? We've talked a lot about stories and narratives, but what is the everyday lived experience of these narratives? We see this in news, and these are just a few of the headlines I've been looking at in the last few days. And they're dominated again by these 4 or 5 big companies. And what made me laugh was one of them was robots gear up to march to the fields to harvest cauliflowers, because in the UK, we're no longer part of Europe, and this breaks my heart. And now we have nobody to pick our cauliflowers. But even the picture of the cauliflower, this isn't a proper cauliflower. It's tiny. You can't, this is not what cauliflowers look like when I grow them. So even when they talk about technology, they can't even get the picture right. And this is just consistent, ongoing, and it's here. And if the narrative is in the news and dominated, then what does that mean? And another story here, I think, which is really disturbing and relates back to the fact that half of the world are not connected is that the radio industry is calling for the government protection from smart assistants, from these so-called smart speakers, that Alexa and Google Home and all of these, the things that people can talk to in their homes, is threatening radio. But radio is the lifeline technology. Dinesh has just talked about that. It's the lifeline technology for that 50% that don't have the internet. And big tech is threatening that too. So not only is it a huge problem for access, it's also destroying the roots that are established in access. And that is parallel with the story that we know we have with food, from the Green Revolution through to many other aspects, that the big answers to food, the technological answers to food, are not only destroying food itself, but the ability to find more established, maybe more traditional ways of doing this. And this is a constant struggle and a constant battle. So, yeah, what do we do about that? And I just wrote down so many quotes from before, and I think, Vishala, as ever, your wisdom is humbling, and the way that you spoke to tech solutions want to look at a small piece, pesticide, pest control, not farming. They don't want to talk about the big picture. And Arshiya, you talked as well about the need for this sort of inclusive and equitable storytelling, because we can talk about the big picture through storytelling. And so I don't think the answer is an answer. I think the answer is a question. And I think the questions that can be told through stories, through the voices of those people, and thank you, Arshiya, for bringing me to the Coffee Collective. It seems like a lifetime ago now. And to start to hear from the wisdom of the people that have been telling stories their whole lives, and oral traditions of passing stories on. These are the storytellers that know how to tell stories better than anyone else, and yet are excluded from the very conversations that need to have the stories told. Where do these stories start? And I passionately believe that they start when we make things. This is a picture yesterday from, actually, I've taken over my son's bedroom because he's gone to university, so I finally have somewhere I can work. That's at the top. And then for my beloved, as anyone who's visited me like Babita to my house, that's my kitchen, and a snapshot of that. And this is where I make things. But when I make things, I make ideas, that I don't.
You've gone mute, John.
Unmute. That was automatic. Someone unmuted me, but that's probably, I'm talking too much. I talk too quickly. I eat too fast. I talk too much, and I eat too much. So maybe that was why I was muted. But I'm coming to the end. I'll speak for maybe 2 more minutes. And I think when those places that we make in show up, and this is the work that people maybe talk to, and Dinesh was talking about, these devices, these playful objects turn up to provoke and prompt and maybe start off and seed stories, that the place that you make in can also be the place that the stories are told, but this time with the people that need to be telling them. So I guess where I want to finish up really is, at the moment we have a situation where made in California or designed in California and made in China is written on the back of so many products, either actually if you have an Apple product, or it's implicitly there anyway. So how do we break this? And so what are the stories where, instead of tens of companies making products for millions of people, can we reverse that, where we have millions of small organizations making products for tens of people, like in Dinesh's villages where he's connected them? And so in order to reverse this economy of scale and production, we need to find those stories about this. And these stories need to come from millions of places. And I guess today we are lucky and privileged to share a few stories with Vishala and Arshiya and Dinesh that we've co-created and with the people they work with. And Pete, who's speaking next, will go into this in more detail. But I want to bring us back really to that sense of these stories need to be based around the lived experience and shared understanding, and that making and the people that make things of anything, whether that's making roti or whether that's making with a 3D printer, I don't mind, but those people that make are the people that I really want to be at the heart of this conversation. So that's my 10 minutes, and thank you. I will hand over to Pete next, I believe, Varta. And I'll stop sharing. And I will mute for real this time.
Thank you, John. Pete, are you there? And if you could go next.
I am here and happy to go next. I kind of just want to take a moment and just, it's been really nice doing this, and it's reminded me of how much fun we had when we were doing it, because it's just great when you work with people who are really smart and have such good insight and are so enthusiastic about what they do. So it's been really nice to kind of listen to everything that people have said so far. So I've got this kind of unenviable task of trying to sort of explain what we did in a concise way. But I just want to zoom out a little bit before we do that. And I guess just talk about this idea about the future a little bit and how design fits into the future. This phrase, kind of hopeful futures, is being used by quite a few people, and it's something that sort of fell out of the project. But it wasn't something that we were aware of at the beginning of the project. What we knew and what was at the heart of what we wanted to do is that we felt that design could be used as a tool that would enable people to kind of imagine and articulate what their view of the future might be or what their hopes were. And something that we realized, and that we'd realized from previous projects, is that when we can articulate those ideas and those hopes in some sort of form and give them, a story, or translate that story into an object or a set of objects, we potentially have the possibility to connect the sort of the dreamer with the enabler. And so in that way, design's role becomes as much about working with people to tell their own stories as it is about enabling those with the power to do something about it to hear. Oh, I'd say my voice is not too clear. Anybody struggling to hear me? Okay. So, in that context, once we've established a story, or once we've established a kind of a design approach, the interesting or the challenging part of that, I guess, is working backwards to work out what needs to happen to make that a reality. And if you think about it that way, then design has the power to kind of put the future into the hands of anyone who's got a story to tell. So when Dinesh was talking about these people telling stories, but their stories aren't being heard, potentially design is one of the ways to amplify those stories and to get them out into the world. And the more that we amplify them and we make them tangible, the more chance there is that they can be realized and affected. And, we talked about hope and this idea of hope, but, the ability to be hopeful in the context of what we're talking about in this project is not evenly distributed. Some of the people that we spoke to, when we asked them about what they were hopeful for in the future, they actually weren't hopeful. And so that created a bit of a challenge to us. And we felt that design is one of the tools that we can use to kind of redress that imbalance around the distribution of hopefulness. So our approach, as Dinesh has sort of suggested, was one of looking towards abstractions. So rather than trying to kind of try and identify problems and solutions like Vishala was talking about, we were trying to understand the way that people live their lives and the things that they were doing at the moment and the hopes they had for the future, and then present these kind of abstractions and prompts and probes that people could look at and investigate and play with and think about what those things might mean for them. And to ground those objects, we tried to use local materials and local processes and things that would be familiar to people. And then we kind of followed an iterative design approach where we would do field work and ethnographic research, and then try and produce things and prompts and probes and put them in front of people, and then go back and do some more research and another set of probes and put them in front of people again. So I am going to share my screen at this point because I think it will bring it to life a little bit better than me just speaking. So hopefully everyone can see that. I'll just zoom out. So this is our timeline here in the middle. And as you can see, it kind of, it starts in the past. Because I guess it's important to highlight that, before this project even started, Babita and John and I have been talking about the kind of things that we wanted to do. And Babita had been definitely talking to other people and the partners about things. And one of the things we realized that's really important about this kind of work is there being like a strong element of trust. I think as Dinesh highlighted, this kind of journey is one that can be quite uncomfortable. Some of the stuff, when you go down the process of abstraction, it can be quite confusing, and you kind of got to trust that we're going somewhere purposeful. And for the partners especially, who are essentially protecting the people that they work with a little bit, you need to be cautious that that this process isn't going to be one that's extractive, and it's going to be one that's equitable, and it's going to be one that's helpful, because we're using up people's time and efforts and energy. So the whole project and the whole design approach is one that was based on trust and respect, I think. So this first stage here took place between November 2018 and January 2019. And it basically started out with us visiting the different partners. And from each of those visits, we kind of wrote up sort of field guide or a report that kind of pulled out key insights that we'd noticed in the field, and started to kind of build up what we referred to as like a baseline or a background set of information that informed the decision making that would happen further on. So here we were kind of visiting Baza in the BR Hills. Over here we're visiting some of Vishala's farmers and growers. And then over here we're in Iraway with Dinesh's class people. And at each stage, like I say, we're kind of writing off and forming this kind of background, I guess this background set of inspiration that we sort of translated into values and research questions and prompts and things like that for ourselves. So that gave us that kind of starting point. And then we had this kind of opportunity, Quicksand organised an occasional festival. Would that be the right word, Babita? Yeah, festival would do. An occasional festival called Unbox, where they invite people from lots of different kinds of communities to come together. And there was an opportunity for us to use this as a platform to kind of gather more insights from a more diverse range of people, but also to kind of test some propositions out with people. So we went there and did some workshops around thinking about the future. We also did some technology probes, like the ones that John showed earlier, that explored issues around biometrics. And the partners as well also did workshops there. So there was a great one, with number 6, about food systems that Buffalo Back did, which was quite influential on our thinking. So there was a great opportunity to start getting some immediate feedback on the way that our ideas were going. And we then had another event back in Dundee, where we invited the partners to come to us, and other academics and other friends and other designers to come to a symposium in Dundee. And what we did was we used that as a platform to try and actually get some prototypes produced and some ideas kind of crystallized a little bit. So if I move over here, we came up with these ideas using comics as a way to kind of tell some of the stories that we're listening to, and to try and present these ideas of what these artifacts from the future might look like. But we also actually made some prototype artifacts. And these kind of prototype artifacts that I'm looking at here, these are very much the kind of thing that we imagined the project being about when we started. because that was kind of what we did. We build these technology prototypes that allow people to kind of have a realistic experience of how that technology might work in the future. So we tested these things out with a kind of wide variety of partners who came to the conference, and we got some really positive feedback about them, about specific groups. So we used those as the basis to basically define, I think Babita talked about the 4 research questions that we had. From those, we developed a whole set of briefs that were quite specific. And then from those briefs, we created another set of objects. And those were what we took out to India to test with people and communities and see how they felt about them. So up here, we're in Iruway with Dinesh's class people. And we were kind of testing out kind of various, well, we tested the same prototypes in both places, but specifically here, we're looking at some kind of sensing devices. And then down here, we were chatting with mango farmers with Vishala. And here we were specifically looking at some kind of solutions that might connect kind of farmer stories with consumers. And these were really, really great sessions because, it felt quite risky and quite scary in terms of how abstract some of these ideas were, but actually the communities that we put them in front of completely understood how they might utilize them and what the value was or wasn't, and they were able to kind of correct us. So yeah, we made all these kind of different prototypes, we tested them, we learned from them. Then coronavirus hit, and the next step was completely derailed. So the plan then was that we would make some final prototypes and they would go and live with people for a while in India, and that we'd be able to get some feedback from people about how they worked, and that would be what we'd write up. As it was, we suddenly couldn't access our workshop, we couldn't work together. So we needed to change the way that we approached the project. And the way that we did that was to come up with stories and illustrations that would describe this kind of world that we started to imagine, this kind of hopeful future. And so what you can see here is 2 examples of artifacts that we designed. So we actually did 12 different artifacts. This is a digital farm tool. And this kind of this illustrates what we were talking about in terms of how we were informed by the kind of environment and the people that we were working with. So this kind of woven package for technology, this is something that exists in Iruway that Dinesh has been working on, about how you can weave the local grasses into these kind of housings that they can put Raspberry Pis and different pieces of technology into. Some of these techniques here were familiar to kind of the area in terms of making existing kind of cooking implements and things like that. So we folded those in. This is a flyer for an electronic hospital, a place where in your community in the future you might go to get your technology repaired or updated. And again, this was produced by Quicksand's local printer. So they took to him the kind of words that we wanted to say, and he laid it out, and then I interpreted that again. So there's 12 of these artifacts on the website. We might get a chance to maybe look at them later, I guess, as a set of 12. And for each of those artifacts, there's a short story that sort of contextualizes it and explains how it might be used. Then we kind of wrote that up into, or we wrote 3 stories up into comics. So we had a story about the future of food, a story about mesh networks. My mind has gone blank. What was our third comic, Babita?
Soliga stories through
the Soliga stories, yeah, that's right, and how voiced AI assistants might support the kind of preservation and the growth of the Soliga culture in the future. So yeah, here's an example of a spread from those comics. These were designed and printed in both English and Canada, with the idea that they could be distributed back into the communities from which they were kind of started as a tool for those communities to use as well. At this point, we also wanted to do something that kind of challenged our thinking or grew it. So we contacted 6 creatives working in India and asked them to reflect and respond to the stories that we put together. So this is an example of one of those kind of reflections up here. And then there's another one down here that Babita's already shown with the exoskeleton. And this is a really, this felt like quite, I mean, it felt like the right thing to do at the right time. And it was interesting that it wasn't something that we'd planned to do previously. And it was very much a response to coronavirus. And partly it was about making sure that we were actually supporting the creative networks of people in India during this very difficult time when nobody was working. But also this idea of actually getting this highly localized take on the project and people responding and challenging our responses just felt really, really valuable, and something that we'd always planned to do with the communities but have been stopped from doing. So we've got these 6 different creative responses. And then we put all this work together and published it in this book, Learning to Speak to an Elephant and Other Stories of Decentralized Digital Futures, and translated that into a website. And that's kind of where it's at. What's really great is that now that we have it in this kind of form where it can be seen together, it starts to kind of live and to breathe outside of just our heads. And so John Thackeray, who wrote the foreword for the book, has been great at sort of talking about it and publicizing it and sharing it with a wider audience. And that's just, I guess that's the great thing. And now that these objects exist, now that we have these kind of these artifacts and these things and these stories, then they can be debated and they can be discussed and they can be challenged. And I think what we're excited by is maybe next trying to kind of work out what the next step is in terms of potentially how we realize some of these objects, and really being able to go back to the communities that we work with and get their feedback on them in more detail. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
But thank you, Pete, for trying to kind of share the journey that we've all been on together for 2 years. So I know we can open up for questions, but before we get into that and sort of just reflecting on what everybody's shared, and also because this is a question that I am faced with constantly in my own work here. I think we've been talking about it, the idea of data capture versus data that is truly owned by people. And there is always an argument for scale and efficiency with large tech and with big tech. So I wanted to just open up for quick reflections from everybody, from the partners around, like what really is the role of decentralization, and how do we begin to build a better case for it with respect to kind of complexity, with respect to kind of these very, very nuanced contexts that all of us are working in, and how can we make also a better case for expression and stories. I think, Arshiya, you brought that up as well. So yeah, it's an open question and reflection, and then maybe we can begin to take questions from the audience as well. Anyone who'd like to start?
Hi everyone, Danish here. So my question is to anyone who can ask. I'm pretty much interested about this mesh network which guys have designed. In the first question is, want to know whether is still in a prototype stage, and if it is in a prototype stage, when it can be accessed to other people in the communities of different parts of India. Second important question is that we all know that right now this centralization of data has been very much going on. If we can check on many authoritarian agencies in India, especially the ministries and the departments, especially the corporates, they're trying to control the data of each and every individual. So just want to know that how mesh network can sustain in this type of scenarios. Just a random, a basic question from my side. Thank you.
Dinesh, if
Hey, yeah, I think you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So first thing, to be honest, it works. It's a great thing to have a mesh network, but at this stage, there's a lot of maintenance. We might have visited the nodes since the mesh just for power fluctuations about 20 times in the last 1 year, right? Because so many unexpected things. There's a power surge, there's a low power, there's something else, and then we'll have to go hunt for it. Otherwise, it's actually a beautiful thing to have. You can replicate and use. We are all completely open source, and we can support uh, uh, where you want to kind of take it forward. Where are you located, Anish?
So I'm right now based out of Mohali, but we are having
Okay.
projects, multiple projects running out in Jumla of Jharkhand and Malkangiri, Orissa, and Chamba in Himachal. Especially in Chamba, the Himachal area,
Okay.
because of the Himalayan terrain, we don't have access to networks with the communities we are working.
You want to say
So,
something? Say. Yeah, Sanket is also with us. So, Sanket, say something.
I think we didn't get when you were trying to set the context. In what is the application you're thinking of for the mesh? Can you repeat that context?
We are losing you, Sanket and Dinesh. But maybe, I don't know if one of you can put some contact that Danish can use to get in touch with you. I was wondering, John, do you have something to add to, because this connects to what we're talking about in terms of decentralization. So if you'd like to add something.
Yeah, so I don't think it's as simple or as clear as two teams, centralization in red, decentralization in blue. One of them's right. And we know this with everything. We know this with food systems. We know this with health systems. We know it with internet systems. But what we do know is that you do need some kind of balance and a mix between the two that fundamentally gives communities and individuals agency. And when we think of mesh networks, I think certainly I've always thought about it of the scale and type that Dinesh has described, of effectively homebrew solutions as an alternative to the established internet, and to provide more resilience, as Dinesh was saying, around power cuts, but also resilience against surveillance. There's a whole, I haven't talked about this time, I'll put some references and links in around the emerging sort of notion of surveillance capitalism, effectively the value driven by your data, and the companies, the big companies that are very, as Arshiya's talked about, this language of extractative. And I think once you give people agency, both over in resilience to physical constraints of power and connectivity, but also over their own data, I think that's increasingly important. But my viewpoint was flipped only this summer, because the latest proposal and implementation from Amazon is there's now the Amazon Mesh Network, where your smart speaker will connect to your neighbor's smart speaker to put an alternative Amazon mesh network in your village or community or your city or your street. And I don't know how I feel about that, because this is Amazon trying to bypass my router, and I largely trust my router, for example. So again, we're back to this thing of it's not one side or the other. It's incredibly complex and nuanced. But if we can put agency and control back in individuals and or community groups that people trust, then I think that's where that starts to take us. Is that okay, Babitha? Is that enough on that?
Yeah, and I see also that Pete's got his hand up. So Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Babita. I was just thinking that it reminded me when John's talking about agency, something that we talked about on the project quite a lot. I mean, because we are dealing with this idea of abstraction, and some of the interactions that we've suggested are quite abstract and quite nuanced and kind of have a cultural root to them rather than a technology root in a way. But one of the things that we explored was the idea that, the way that we increasingly interact with the internet at the moment is becoming more and more abstract. And in the process of becoming abstract, we lose a sense of agency over the interaction itself. It's like the difference, I guess, between buying a meal that's being pre-prepared and then being given the ingredients and knowing how to make the meal. So one of the stories and the artifacts that we proposed was the coding kit for schools that would teach children how to code an AI and all the set of rules and behaviors and the algorithms that would lead to that AI's behavior. Because I guess that sort of approach is one that embeds technological agency with people in the communities at a very young age. So I just thought it was worth bringing that up around the idea of like agency and how that might be enacted and realized.
Arshiya, I was wondering if you wanted to add like also about not just specifically mesh, but yeah.
No, I mean, yes, thanks for calling on me. I was sort of thinking about this idea of data because I remember that we had through the project detailed conversations about, who owns data, if people are ready to be owners of data, because I mean, it's still, again, these are kind of things that that have sort of sprung up on many of the indigenous communities we work with. Before they're sort of, I think they're still kind of ambivalent about figuring out what all of this is. So, one of the things that I think really underlying all of this stuff is the uncertainty, the ambivalence, the fears that might, kind of, I think, determine whatever that future solution is. So as we solutionize and, just kind of response to, John, what you were saying is, in addition to all of these, I think we also need a safe space to solutionize. So the kind of, and in the conservation context in India, as things are increasingly less decentralized. So the regulatory framework that I think really determines what happens in forest areas and on the lives of people in and around forest areas is increasingly centralized. Technologies like surveillance technologies are biodiversity is used to justify the need for surveillance technologies across the board. And so suddenly people who have been living in forests and homes have, the forest has been their home for 1,000 years, are now worried about where the camera traps are and where the drones are flying above. And it's a really strange kind of situation that I think people are kind of beginning to kind of, grasp. And in that, I think there's this pressure for this one hit kind of solution from community members. And even in the conservation context, what it is like, so, okay, so, biodiversity is being lost, deforestation is happening, there's a lot of tiger poaching. Oh, you community members come up with that one solution that's like almost foolproof that will solve and stop tiger poaching forever. So that there's never any deforestation, there's never any encroachment into forest. You're never taking your cattle out to graze, right? Without that idea that work in progress happens, people make mistakes, people are experimenting, that space seems to really be exclusively for one kind of experimentation and not really in that local community kind of space. There's no space for experimentation there. And so I think, I don't really know, Babita. I mean, I worry, and I'm trying to understand what data and data ownership is. So I don't really know, how we navigate this at all. But it's sort of whatever we might do in a sustainability marketplace is kind of going parallel to forces that are increasingly centralized, increasingly surveillance based. in all of the regulatory structures that kind of coexist, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm less hopeful in this space than I am in others, I think.
Thank you, Arshiya. Juhi, I've seen your hand, but I know we've had multiple conversations also with Vishala about this, and we currently also working in the buffer zones and the eco-sensitive zones around the Bannerghatta forest, and connecting back to what Arshiya said, when we're thinking about solutions, for example, in the conservation space, it tends to be biophysical and does not account for social, cultural, spiritual realities of people. So how do we even begin to unpack data to think about accommodating? Forget accounting and actively designing, but even just accommodating these other realities of people. So Vishala, I just wanted to ask you if you could quickly reflect, especially in the context of certification and all of what you've been working with.
Yes, I think I'll just probably say a few words from a very advocacy perspective, apart from, because there is this whole spectrum of things that we do, and then there's always been this need to kind of interact with the regulatory framework and then figure out on how do we, because they are not people who are going to buy our ideas of stories, buy our ideas of decentralization, of connections, of relationships, or of trust itself. So when we went with the certification system, where we said the core of the system is about trust, about peer review, and a system which only kind of understands a linear flow of anything, be it data, be it relationship, be it supply chain. It's always linear. And when we were presenting an idea which is a web and not a linear, and we said there is something there's something very nice about local markets, there's something very nice about peer reviews, peer support, and then even the data being within the peer group, which is more relevant for them and which is more important for the producers and the customers. There were a lot of questions, there were a lot of apprehensions, obviously, because it doesn't fit into the narrative of those large systems which are created and those large institutions that are created, which have a way of managing things. So honestly speaking, I think the only way we had out was to actually just say, leave us alone. Give us exemptions. We are small, we are irrelevant in this large game plan. So small players, please leave us alone. And that's the only way we could actually figure out to belong, to be part of this largest regulatory system, because we don't want to fall out. We don't want to be illegitimate also in whatever we do. We want to be relevant, but still have our own space there and not be pushed into this rigor of collecting data every day and every action that you're doing in the farm and bringing things to the consumer. So it's been a battle, and like Arshiya said, there are no solutions. Honestly speaking, we are also grappling with what is right and what is wrong, and I mean, trying to hold space for everyone, trying to hold space for every perspective is quite draining at times. And then we said, okay, I think the best thing to do is that hold these spaces for small players, hold these spaces for people who don't want to use a smartphone. I mean, the last thing that we want is a certification system making sure that every farmer owns a smartphone and is like entering every other data every other day. So we said, let's get these exemptions out. And that's the current scenario. And that's how we are fighting for these spaces and ensuring that we have these. It's still not enough. There's a lot more to do. And we honestly, I think, as much as sometimes it really feels like, okay, now, because there is something, I think a couple of times I've told Babita also, when I hear this word mainstreaming of something, I really come back and think, what do we mean by this mainstreaming? And with organic food, when the narrative is about mainstreaming organic, my first question always is, who in this world is going to deny safe food or say that, no, I don't want to eat safe food, but then I just want chemically grown food? Yeah. So the mainstreaming blocks are elsewhere and not where we think the problems are. And I think and those problems cannot, I don't think, can be sorted with technology and the amount of data. We do have data, honestly speaking, we do have data which points out to where the issues are, but then the solutions always seem to be like, something similar, probably given in a different narrative. So yes, thank you.
I just wanted to check if there are any other questions. We don't, of course, have to go all the way to 6. If there are any questions, please do raise your hand or type this out, type it out in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm going to ask everyone for final reflections, and then we can close as well. So I don't see any questions, and I just want to kind of share my final reflections, which is, okay, I see that there is someone who's turned on video. Vipul, yes, please go.
I'm sitting here in London, so I'm closer to John and Pete, I think. Hi. This is kind of interesting one. I came into the discussion late, so I probably missed a bit of it. But this is something that looking at technology and how it works is something I've been, I graduated as a designer a long time ago. And I came here and things with design in UK. I studied here and sort of looked at internet, especially at about 25 years ago, how it would work in India and things like that. There are two aspects which I'm just throwing sort of ideas across, which I've been thinking of. One is any kind of network, what it is allowing agency to people who are working, who are in the region, to at least have the, as I think John said, Pete said, is to give them the tools necessary to be able to do what they, access ways to use technology. So that is very important. What people do with it, how they collect it, how they use it, how they share it, how they work with it in terms of creating a network or environment for themselves is the second aspect. But first is really enabling people, empowering people to be able to understand what is possible and how they can do it. And especially in an environment where we are constantly, especially in India, we are looking at all the big players, whether it's Jio or the Tatas or, whether it's the Reliances of the world, trying to and constantly create environments where people have been allowed to use technology in a way which is controlled in many ways, and then the state gets into it very easily to make decisions on behalf of people. Other thing which is important here, which is the very nature of what we think is shared and what is precious in terms of data. I mean, example, I was just looking at my own group, Culprich, which I'm part of, and we had to put in information about ourselves, including passport numbers and all that, which are available as an open Excel file right now, pretty much to anybody to see. And what we think is precious in terms of what is data and what is the preciousness of data when we collect it. It's a very social way of thinking about it. We like to put our house up on the map. We like to share things in a way that is important. So this whole notion of what is data itself and what it means, and therefore the preciousness of what it is, and then what are the kind of ways in which data can be, I think what's important is education around what is ways can be misused or used, and how it can actually work for positive or negative effects that can take place in people's lives. And I came in late, so I might have missed a bit of things, but yeah, just thrown in my couple of bits. Yeah,
Thank you, Vipul, for sharing. Pete, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Vipul. I completely agree with what you're saying. And it just reminded me of, well, two things really. One was like one of the kind of artifacts and stories that we came up with alongside the kind of AI coding systems was this idea of data stewards that would sort of exist at a community level and would essentially act as a kind of an aggregator of community ideas around what data was and wasn't important, and kind of protect community data in the same way that we might protect this kind of physical community. And so I just thought that kind of like played into some of the conversations that we were having recently. But also, you know, I was recently reading a book that was just talking about the kind of the actual process by which technology is designed these days, and talk about things like, you know, talk about data that's exposed in the real world. And so particularly things like people being able to use Uber data to track individuals to their home and stuff like that. And what it was arguing is, you know, that those kind of decisions wouldn't have been made if a more diverse and a wider range of people were in the room when those decisions were taking place. So, you know, if you'd had women in the room while she was talking about what you might be able to do with data on an Uber ride, you're unlikely to end up with a situation that allows women to be stalked by using Uber. And I think what we're talking about here is some of the same stuff, that, you know, unless we actually get communities and marginalized communities into the room or part of the story, then they're never going to be properly represented in terms of having control or agency over their own data. Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to throw that in.
John, do you want to add?
Sure. I mean, it was really following on somewhere between what Pete was saying, and I think Tane, you put this quite really interesting question in. I don't know if you want to say it out loud, or should I just read it out? What do you want to do, Tane? Because I think this follows.
Read it out loud. So I just typed it out as it came to mind.
Yeah, so this sort of what's the synergies between the hardware, effectively, and then the decentralized networks, which Dinesh was talking to, and the emerging advocacy around ideas such as data cooperatives. And I think Pete spoke to that a little with the data stewards, and maybe a concrete example between the two, which also shows up in one of our fictional stories about the future of voice assistants in Soliga tribes, is, I think, if you start to look at the decentralization of the kind of massive data sets that are required for powerful AI, such as, let's take the most powerful we're all familiar with at the moment, voice assistants. The reason that Amazon Alexa is able to understand English, for example, is because of the huge data set, the closed data set that Amazon own and have been buying up over many, many years. It takes 10,000 hours of labeled human speech in one accent, in one dialect, in one language, for an AI, a voice AI, to be able to do that. That is vast amounts of time and effort and money and that resource. So Mozilla have this project called Common Voice, and I can put a link in, or someone else can for me, which effectively decentralizes the database of voice, and you can start to label your own voice. And nobody then owns this. It's an open database that you can then train your AI on, because that technology is actually fairly simple, relatively speaking, of the sort of the neural networks involved. But it's the data that's the real power. So that's an example of that. And we were building the Soliga story in our book, and we can put a link to this, was essentially building on that idea of you need to decentralize the hardware and the data. And then you need something like a data steward in the middle, and an educational program and a set of resources to enact that. We could talk for hours about this, Tane. Happy to pick this up in another conversation, but I just wanted to put that somewhere in between.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that I think the big thing was that when we were building these stories of hopeful futures, we saw practices which were around stewardship. So some of the communities that we'd gone to, there were very, very prominent systems of water stewardship, for example, that were very strong. Similarly, whether it was with the more farmer-centered organic farming certification system that Vishala has been working with, the idea that it is a co-owned system where they're able to kind of generate and make use of the data themselves rather than just be passive data entry people for some other distant centralized system was very, very prominent. And that's really what we built some of these hopeful narratives around. And I know like Arshiya has also talked about this, whether it's, I mean, you think like the default is to think about blockchain as the solution for distributed certification and authentication of produce. But how does that even account for the Soliga way of making sense of the world, of how they've been translating generations of knowledge around the forest and practices around that. So yeah, and I just to add to that. We have about 15 minutes left, so we don't need to go the full 2 hours. So I'm gonna ask if all of our speakers can give like 2-minute reflections. It could even be a question. I think that's really the journey we wanted to share with you. I don't think this project or our explorations together have been about finding solutions, but to potentially explore and uncover more questions together. So I will ask everyone to maybe like share for 2 minutes. Arshiya, if you want to start.
Yes, of course. I think I sort of oscillate between wondering whether, wondering how much, and kind of following up from the word mainstream and Vishala's frustration with the word mainstreaming. I think I kind of oscillate between wondering whether we completely break down existing power structures and sort of rebuild things right back up in the way that we feel is fair and equal, or we try and sort of do the best we can with what existing structures, systems, technologies exist, and kind of reflecting back on this notion of power and power really determining so much of how things flow, knowledges, technologies, data for sure. I'm kind of beginning, now to sort of be inclined to think about whether we resist actively the way that the demands that markets make from us, the extractive nature that some of the technologies or regulatory systems, maybe we just don't resist enough. And if it is something that if we've learned anything from the social movements that indigenous communities have led, particularly in the environment and conservation space across the world, it is perhaps to resist rather than to sort of make do or be okay with incremental microscopic changes and things like that. And so when part of the project and even in this our exploration of what a superhero was or who a superhero was for many of the community members we spoke to, we tried to, through this comic, sort of create what a Soliga superhero would be, who she would be. And it was really important that it was a she, because while we think of farmers, we don't think of women farmers, and many of the times when we have gatherings, even to talk about these kinds of things, women don't come. So this woman superhero who was at this conference doing really kind of cool things that none of the Soliga kids have ever really even fathomed. I'm just wondering, what it did, I think, was in some sense place value on some of the technologies or some of the knowledges that people, intuitive knowledges that people have held and used that we've never really considered as technologies. The way to walk through the forest without a map, to understand how long it's been that the elephant has walked through this path, to look at the dung of an elephant and know when the elephant has walked down this particular road. To look at, so one of the most fascinating examples that we've had that, and it kind of relates back to, certifications and blockchains and so on, is that, we did this learning exchange visit to another farm that was organic certified, and some of the producers walked in and said, but hey, where are the bees? And I'm not really sure your farm is, organic certified, because I don't see any bees here. And if you walked into my coffee farm, which is organic, I've never used pesticide or chemicals in it, there'd be bees. And so I don't believe your lab test. I'm looking for bees as indicators of whether your farm is truly organic or not. Maybe that's the sort of value, and maybe that's where the power structure should shift, or maybe we need that shift. We need to ask for that shift rather than necessarily kind of accepting the way that things are and then sort of adjusting along with it. That those are my kind of thoughts at the moment, and of course I have no real roadmap for how we do this, but I feel like we just need to resist a lot more actively and a lot more confidently and unapologetically.
Thank you, Arshiya. Dinesh, I'm not sure, are you still there? If you
I'm here.
Okay.
I don't know how clear my signal would be, but we'll try. So, but anyway, I think I've said quite a lot, but reflection wise, I feel like, sorry, a lot of ambulances and other things. Okay. Reflection wise, I feel like we just need to look at how for thousands of years, especially in an Indian context, elsewhere too, we have kind of marginalized people from as not being invisible, not seen when it comes to them as knowledge holders, and more so since the school system started. And but in spite of like 300 years of schools in India, say, we have maybe 1 billion people, I would say, are still, I would consider as not very literate. So if this is the scenario, then what is the role of technology in kind of bringing equity? So if you can start thinking about what could it be that might, might help, because technology has that possibility, and beyond that, to get away from tech determinism in a way, and like what Vishala was saying, leave us alone. That can apply to a lot of people, a lot of contexts, because for local decentralized spaces, whether it's a Wi-Fi mesh network, whether it's what are the enabling things? What are the things like we don't regulate and restrict and throw them out as non-conforming situations? It becomes a primary thing. So I don't know. There's quite a lot in terms of how we need to open up the freedom of expression in this specific direction, is what I feel. Yeah.
Thank you, Dinesh. Vishala, any final quick reflections?
Yeah, like I usually talk a lot. I think I've spoken enough, but more than reflections, I would say this whole process that we went through, this whole journey of understanding this decentralization and the whole exercise that we did, the probes and interactions, honestly speaking, helped us immensely. And especially because that was around the time we were also grappling with the idea of these participatory certification systems and trying to make sense of it. I think from then we have also come a long way, and we have been able to put a few narratives in place, which which kind of balances our ideas of stories and knowledge systems, and still we are able to articulate something, and like Arshiya says, even resist this a top-down narrative. Like, for example, we started with soil health, which is such a big narrative in organic agriculture, and there are these lab parameters which are given as the test, as a checklist to be ticked off to say that this is with this kind of soil health your produce is organic. But then we realize it's very, very limiting, and it's very, very lab science driven and not knowledge driven. So our counter narrative or our resistance or our answer to that was being to talk to farmers and get the farmers to articulate in their language and what they think is important for their soil health. And so we have been like compiling this over the last 2 years, and we hope that one day we will be able to call this our standards of soil and not the standards that's come down from the industry. So we are also trying to be a little more structured and trying to work on probably agroecological zones and put these practices together, a package of practices and a package of standards that the farmers working in these similar conditions are able to articulate from their knowledge systems, from the knowledge systems that they've acquired over years of farming and over generations of wisdom that's lying with these farmers. So that I think has been a nice experience for us, a lot of learning and also figuring out on how do we interact with these larger systems. Like I said, there's no good and the bad. And for example, in terms of large technology, that way speaking, WhatsApp has been extremely helpful for us. So we are not keeping away from anything, or neither are we trying hard to belong somewhere, but then trying to put our own place there in the larger thing. Yeah. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishala. John?
I'll be quick. I think I love the fact that bees are our future, and maybe they have a hive of stories that are fed by the nectar of education. So I'm going to keep looking for bees, but we're just entering the darkest, coldest months of our year. So I might not find them as they go underground. But actually, come spring, I really, really hope, and my hope is that I'll see more bees than ever. And I hope that we'll be sharing our space with those bees and perhaps with all of you. And it was really lovely to be a part of this evening's chat. So have a lovely, lovely, lovely evening, and see you next time.
Thank you, John. Pete?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just worth reflecting on the idea in terms of this idea of like resistance, that, technologies frequently end up sort of affecting sort of social and cultural change, whether deliberately or inadvertently, as Dinesh sort of referenced, in terms of like losing these cultural values through this influx of kind of different ideas through technology and different scope of what's allowed through certain technologies. And so I do think we need to resist that. And in the same way that we talk about like heritage seeds and the maintenance of heritage seeds now providing us with opportunities to combat issues related to climate change and kind of monocultures of growing, we need to be looking at a kind of variety of ideas around technology that will enable us to resist a kind of monoculture of technology that's being introduced into the future at the moment. So I really like this idea of disobedient design and disobedient technology that is actively resistful or resistant. And I think that's a really interesting starting point maybe for what happens next.
Thank you, Pete. We're at time, so I'm just going to say thank you, Arshiya, Vishala, Dinesh, John, Pete. It's been lovely to catch up and chat. And thank you very much to the Vikalp team for giving us this chance to talk about our project. And hopefully we'll hear from some of you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Babita, very much for hosting the Varta today. I think you've left us with a lot of questions. The whole team, in fact, has left us with a lot of questions to ponder over and some really great stuff which has come out. We have the Extraordinary Work of Ordinary People series. I'm just sharing.
You're on mute.
Yeah. If anyone is interested in reading up about it. And thank you very much, everyone, for being with us during the Varta session.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.